We are canning crushed tomatoes today. And I actually think that canning tomatoes is a great way to get started with canning because there's two types of canning. There is water bath canning and there's pressure canning. And there are two different setups. And I'm going to show you what those setups look like. I have it all outside. And the reason for that is because the weight of either a water bath canner or a pressure canner combined with the heat can break a glass stove cooktop. I wish I didn't have a glass stove cooktop. I wish it wasn't electric. I wish it was gas, and I wish it had coils. I really wish it was a wood burning stove, but you know, neither here nor there. This is something that you could do over a fire. So in the event that you did not have electricity and you did not have any sort of setup with gas, you could do this over a fire. The key to that would be practicing now with just jars and water, so that way you can get a good sense of temperature and time and controlling those factors in that sort of a setup. Um, so with water bath canning, you are canning anything that is acidic, like tomatoes or jams and jellies. Pressure canning is for anything that is not acidic, like broth or vegetables. And so likely you'll have a setup for both. I already have my tomatoes crushed and in my pot here. I'm going to show you what it looks like. It's just this huge pot. And this is actually the insert for my Instant Pot, which I also really love to use and cook with. Um, so I want to tell you a little bit about how I prepared this since I'm not doing this portion for you live. It's very similar whether or not you wanted to do tomato sauce, crushed tomatoes, or paste. And then, of course, there's so many other varieties in terms of like a seasoned sauce or salsa. But essentially, I have had all of my tomatoes in the freezer and I've been canning since spring. And I still have more tomatoes in the freezer. I grew so many tomatoes. In terms of what tomatoes work best, technically any tomatoes would work best. For sauces and for paste, your paste tomatoes would work best because they're more fleshy and less seedy. Um, I had a combination of paste tomatoes and some slicer tomatoes, which are like those big, juicy slices that you would imagine like on a sandwich, for example, Cherokee purple, I think pink girl, and there's another variety that I grew. But in the end, you can use all of them. It really doesn't matter. The paste tomatoes are just going to give you more flesh, more paste. And so what I did is in the spring, when I was super overwhelmed with all of these tomatoes and I could not keep up with canning all these tomatoes, I literally just tossed them in a plastic bag from the grocery and tossed them in the freezer, and that was it. Some people like to cut off the tops, the little green nubs, but I didn't want to do that because I didn't want to risk frostbite or it affecting the integrity of my tomato in the freezing process. What happens when you freeze your tomatoes and take them out is you can either let them thaw on the counter, thaw in the fridge. I put them all in my sink and I ran cold water in there and I let them sit for like 5 or 10 minutes. And then after that, I ran some hot water and I literally was able just to take a tomato and it under the hot water, let its skin peel just right off and put it in this big compost bin here for my chickens. Chickens will love this. You can also save the skins and dehydrate them and make a tomato powder, which is a really nice seasoning to add to sauces and soups. And then I cut my pieces into quarter chunks. And you wouldn't have to necessarily cut them if you want to do tomato sauce or tomato paste, but for crushed tomatoes, You want to cut them in these quarter chunks. So then what happens is I've got this big bowl of all of these quartered tomatoes that have been that have their skin and tops removed. And I do one layer of tomatoes at the bottom of the pot, just enough tomatoes at the bottom of this pot in order to cover the bottom of the pot. I turn the stove on to high, and eventually they're going to start melting a little bit, and I crush them down. So that way it's super juicy. Once that juice has spread and I've got like this couple of inches of basically crushed tomato juice in the pot, I add the rest of my tomatoes slowly. So eventually I have this filled up pot with all of my crushed tomatoes. And at that point, I'm not smushing anymore. I'm just minimally stirring because I want the crushed tomatoes to retain those chunks. And one of the first times I made crushed tomatoes, I mashed everything and then I didn't have crushed tomatoes. I just had like a tomato sauce with, I also didn't peel those, with some peels and seeds. And I have used it as crushed tomatoes in my recipe that calls for crushed tomatoes, and it works fine. But I wanted to keep the integrity of the chunks. And so after that first layer of crushing everything, I just put everything and I just let it cook. So now I've got some nice chunks. So that brings us to the present of where we are with canning the tomatoes. And I want to show you some essential materials and ingredients that I have that we're going to use throughout this next process. The first is the Ball Book of Canning, and I will send all of these materials out with the recording and notes from this workshop. But this is like, and this is your Bible for canning. I mean, it's got everything in here. The spiral bound is really nice for the sake of utilizing it as a cookbook, but it's going to tell you everything for both water bath canning and pressure canning. You can always go rogue and find some recipes online after, but this is like the basics. And it's going to tell you how to prepare your jars and all of your equipment, and it's going to tell you specific recipes and specific times. The next thing I'm using is a fine pink mineral salt. This is Redmond's. The key is it being a fine salt. You can use Celtic salt. Iodized salt does not have a place in my home because it's been stripped from its natural minerals that are actually really good for us. And so I use this fine salt. Lemon juice, which I've pre-squeezed and is going to be used as our citric acid source. Also, basically our preservative for our canned tomatoes. I don't like to use citric acid from the store or labeled as citric acid because citric acid can be many things. It can literally be some home squeezed lemon juice. It could also be derived from black mold, which if any of you guys have heard anything about mold toxicity, it can lead to a plethora of health issues. And so I try to avoid citric acid at all costs, and lemon juice will work just fine. I, of course, have my teaspoons and my measuring spoons here. I have this little butter warmer, and the story about this is that I don't use a microwave anymore for radiation sake. And so we have a toaster oven and this butter warmer to warm up everything. This is to warm up liquids. But this is really, really helpful in canning. You could also use a ladle. As long as it has like a little spout on it, it's just extremely convenient from transferring whatever it is that you're canning into your jars. I have this funnel that actually comes with a kit of other tools, including these like jar holders and some other tools. Sometimes I use them, sometimes I don't, but really the funnel is what I use the most. White vinegar. We're going to use this to clean the rims of our jars. I have my lids and my rings for the jars. So these being the rings and these being the lids. Notice how I shouldn't even be holding it like this. That is the rogue canning side of me. You should know that there are many rogue methods of canning that you just have to decide where you feel comfortable with. But there is a tool with a little magnetic device that allows you to pick these up. The whole thing is that you don't want to touch the rubber on the inside. These need to be clean. You should only use the lids once. And these are sorts of like, FDA, USDA guidelines. And the rings you can use multiple times as long as they're not rusty. Let's see. And then, of course, I've got my pint jars here that are all clean. Emphasis on clean. You cannot overdo making sure all of your equipment is clean. I also like to have everything in just like a tray, just to easily move things around, move things outside. You can obviously can in pints, you can can in quarts, you can can in half quarts, you could can in half gallons. And the different recipes for how much salt or lemon juice is all mentioned specifically by quart or pint in the Ball book. Let's see. I think that's about it in terms of materials. What you should know is that there are two methods of what's called packing. Packing is putting the food into the jars. You can do cold packing, where you have something cold going into cold jars, or at least not hot jars. Or you can hot pack, in which case your food is hot. And if your food is hot, your jars need to be hot and your lids and rings need to be hot. The reason for this is because as it relates to the water bath canner or the pressure canner, you have to match the temperature to avoid breaking. So if you have something cold going into hot, it could break the glass and vice versa. If you need to make everything hot, then and so determining how you do it is basically on when your food's gonna be ready. I did these crushed tomatoes yesterday. They're out of the fridge, they're cold. So I don't have to do anything else. They're gonna go into my water bath canner in cold water. But if this was hot and I was ready to can them right now, I would take this tray of jars and I would set them in the oven at 200 degrees for about 20 minutes. I would then take this bowl of lids and rings, and this is why I have them in a bowl, just because of practice of hot packing, even though I'm not doing that right now. I would wait until I'm ready to pack, and then I'd put the hottest possible water in this bowl. So everything is hot. I would also make sure that my water in my water bath canner or in my pressure canner is hot. So that's one of the most important things to walk away with, is knowing it doesn't matter what type of canning you're doing, you need to commit to cold packing or hot packing. Let's see. I think that is everything for this step. And so now I'm going to go ahead and pack my jars. And let's see if I can get this set up so you can see. I might just have to move my camera. I'm looking at the recipe to confirm how much salt and how much lemon juice is going into these. and it says for a pint, I need a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. I'm sorry, a tablespoon of lemon juice and a 1/2 teaspoon of salt. So now you're not going to see my face so much. You're going to see my jars. And ideally, you would add your salt and lemon before you put the tomato sauce in there, because then it's naturally going to kind of mix on its own. I'm not going to do all of these jars. I'm pretty sure that I'll have enough tomato sauce or tomato, can't even remember the name, chopped tomatoes to fill all of these jars and maybe even have some more left over. But for the sake of not wasting lemon juice or salt, I'm just going to do maybe half of them first. So I'm going to do my salt first, a 1/2 teaspoon. I don't really need this right now. So I'm doing a 1/2 teaspoon in each pint. And then after this, go ahead and just do 6. One more interesting note while I'm thinking about it, for anyone that has ever had issues with canning or freezing their jars, jars that don't have a shoulder are freezable. Jars that do have a shoulder are not freezable. That's a whole nother topic, but just while I was thinking about it. All right, so a tablespoon of lemon juice for each jar or for each pint. You don't have to strain out the pulp. I would probably get just out the seeds. Okay. And so now I'm going to go ahead and start pouring everything in. The next thing you need to know with packing is the term headspace. Every recipe is going to call for a different type of, or a different measurement of headspace. Headspace is the space between the top line of where your food is and the top of the jar. So it includes these rings here. And it says in this recipe for, let's see, it should say how much headspace. All right. Well, this one doesn't say how much headspace. So I'm going to go with the standard 1 inch, which is basically right here at the bottom of this line at the very top of the jar. And that's how much I'm going to fill it. I'm going to get another rag so it can get a little messy as I'm pouring. But even as I'm just like getting this right now, I can see that I've got some nice chunks. If you do too much, it can cause for an insecure seal. You know, all these little things I'm telling you are basically the tips and tricks for you to get a solid seal. So as I'm doing this, we can have the conversation about, well, what about botulism? What about things spoiling and going bad? The beauty of canning is that as long as you are a fairly conscious human, you can know whether or not it's good or bad. And the first way of knowing that is by the seal. So after you can these, you'll want to put them on the counter, and as soon as they cool down to the touch, well, I should actually say you're supposed to leave them on the counter for 24 hours before you take off the rings and before you test the seal. So you test the seal by holding it, and that is, again, that's just these lids right here. These are on top of the jar. You hold the jar up by this lid, and if it doesn't come undone, it's sealed. Most jar lids will also have like a little bump in the middle, And once they're pressurized, that bump will go down and you can't pop this. So it will be completely solid and sunken in, and you'll hear a little ting when you take your jars out, because all of the air will vacuum out of the jars. And that's why this food is shelf stable for years. The FDA will say 3 years. The rogue canner will say as long as it's sealed. You just have to decide where you stand with that. I have cans, over 100 jars this season. And the other day I had this feeling like I wanted to go in and test my jars. So when you store them, you don't store them with the rings. You eventually take the rings off and it's just the lids. If you've ever wondered why it looks like people don't have the rings on their jars, that's why. You want to be able to pick them up by their lid and test and look at things. And so out of my 100+ jars that I've canned, I just went and took a look at my potatoes to see how they were doing some months after canning them. And I could tell that one of the potatoes just looked funny. Like they were kind of browning. They looked different from the rest. Picked it up by the lid and the lid just popped right off. It wasn't a secure seal. A little bit of oxygen had found its way, and that's how botulism grows. And so that's how you know you're safe, is by the seal. Otherwise, if there's no oxygen, botulism cannot grow. And your food is safe. And I mean, look at it, smell it, and confirm whether or not it looks good. Hopefully that has cleared away any suspicion or concern about botulism and unsafe canning. So let's keep going with this. Because the next thing we're going to do is actually put it into the canner. I'm going to have quite a bit here. I'm probably going to have more than these 8 jars. You can stack them. It's recommended that for beginners, you don't stack them at first, and you just get used to canning them without. But since I have this available now, I'm going to go ahead and do my tablespoon of lemon juice for these here. And then we'll do all 8 jars. I can tell you that every time you can and you put away food, it feels like such a major success, like such a major accomplishment. And it is the ability to just put away food and have tomato sauce that tastes like spring tomato sauce all year round is incredible. Does it affect the nutritional quality? Yes, as heating everything does, but it extends your food shelf life. So, we all should recognize that we need meat, we need protein, and we need fat, but we can get a lot of vitamins and minerals from vegetables. And especially if it's homegrown, or at the very least, locally farmed, you're still getting some nutrition from your canned foods. So, I think it can bring up the question, well, why should I can? Why not dehydrate? Or why not freeze everything? Freezing, of course, is dependent on electricity, and you would need to freeze in jars, unless you're freezing in plastic, but that's not really a great thing to do either. Don't get me wrong, we have plastic in our house, we have plastic bags. I can't escape plastic, but I want to avoid plastic because of the microplastics that leach into our food and get absorbed into our bodies and are excreted through our urine. I don't think you probably didn't expect me to talk about that today. But this is why glass is best. And this is why we want to take care of our glass. Um, but this is also why canning is so important. Freezing is going to hold the most nutritional value um, in terms of preservation. The next would probably be dehydrating, but you can't you can dehydrate tomatoes, but not if you want tomato sauce or crushed tomatoes or tomato paste. And so by canning, you're also expanding your food options. So now what we're going to do is I kind of made a mess as I was pouring these. It was like flopping all over the place. So the next thing I'm going to do is wipe down my jars. And after I do this, I am going to wipe them all down. Sweet girl, I need to move this out the way, sugar. You can help me in just a second, okay? My daughter loves to help me put on the lids and the rings. Cece, do you want to grab the little magnetic thing in the drawer so you can do the lids? All right. I'm just doing this because it made such a mess. Now I'm going to get a fresh paper towel to clean the tops. Another thing that you want to look at that's going to affect your seal is make sure there's no cracks in the glass. That will also affect the seal. And everything else looks good here. So now I'm taking vinegar to a paper towel and I'm going to wipe the rims. And I'm really just trying to get the top right where the lid would make contact with the jar. All right. Now we are ready to seal these guys up. Let me see if I can. Get my daughter, will you help me? Okay. Let's get this material right here. So, by the way, this is the accessory kit right here that has the funnel in it, and then also this handy dandy little metal thing that my daughter likes to use, and we're going to use that today. Let me go through. I see there's some questions in chat, and I want to make sure that we're present. All right, why do we use vinegar to do that? What is it about the vinegar that helps the seal as opposed to just wiping the rims clean? The vinegar is antibacterial, antifungal. So, I could just, in a rogue situation, if I didn't have access to vinegar, I would wipe them with just water. But while I have access to vinegar, it's going to ensure sterilization, contact between the lid and the jar. So that's why I want to do that. She's going to help me get the rings on. Can you put the lemon down while you do, or at least do that? Yeah. Notice we are not touching the bottom of the lid. And we are putting our rings down wrist tight. So we want to be able to, let's see, that one's not going all the way. It needs to be able to close all the way. And honestly, I just grabbed a bunch of random jars. So, I don't know if you can see this, but I am trying to close this and it's not clicking. So I'm probably going to have to redo that one. Let's do another one. So wrist tight, meaning you can't really get it any tighter. All right, let's keep going. Oh, and I think that one might have two. Yeah, so why don't you pick that one up? Okay. When hot packing, the lemon juice has to be hot or room temperature is okay. When hot packing, the lemon juice does not have to be hot because the food that you're using is probably going to be hot enough for that tablespoon of lemon juice that it will still be really hot. So you don't have to worry about that. So you'll notice as the other one, sugar. So remember I mentioned the difference with the jar that had no shoulder? That's the wide mouth jar. And then the other jar is the regular. So when you get lids, if you get ball jars in the beginning, they'll come with lids and rings, but when you order more, since you're not supposed to use the same lid over again, you'll pay attention to what jars you have, either the regular or the wide mouth. Let's do this one, and then what we'll do is we'll need to get another jar for the one that didn't close all the way. So Rogue Canning, I've got some ball jars here. I've got one wide mouth. I've got a couple of regulars. But the beauty about canning is that anytime you use something out of a jar, like pickles that you've bought from the grocery, anything that comes from a pint jar, you can can with that pint jar. These lids and rings are pretty universal, and that they'll fit just about everything with the exception of that one that you saw. I'm gonna get another jar and see if I can. Well, I'm gonna get this one that still has a label on it, but this was some honey. Let's put everything in here. This is a clean jar. And it's gonna want me to put a little bit more in there. So again, this is one of the beauties of canning is that you'll pretty much always have jars available. All right. That's about an inch of headspace. And I'm going to wipe the rim with the vinegar. And I'm also going to wipe the inside of this lid just to be safe. So again, just know that some of the things that I'm doing on here are Rogue Canning. I feel like everyone needs a little bit of that in their life. All right. So I've got my tomatoes packed and ready to go into the canner. Let's see a couple other questions real quick before I go outside. When you cooked the tomatoes, how long did you cook them for, and how long did you let cool before adding to the jars? Crushed tomatoes take the least amount of time. I could have done them last night pretty easily. I would say it maybe took 30 minutes from like putting that first layer of tomatoes in. Because you really don't have to like bring it to a boil even. You're just trying to get everything immersed in there, defrosted. But it was hot when I had it ready to go last night. With tomato sauce, the difference would be that as soon as you do that, and as soon as everything has thawed, you pour it into a strainer and you strain out all the pulp and the seeds. So all that's left is with just the juice. They need to see me, sweetie. I need you to scoot down just a little bit. Thank you. All you get is just the juice. So if I were to hot pack that, perhaps I would just reheat it on the stove until it comes to a low boil. Now, tomato paste takes a long time because essentially you do the same thing with the tomato sauce. You put it through a strainer, and then after you put it through the strainer, you put it back into the pot. You actually add your lemon and salt into the pot, and then you cook it down until it becomes a paste. And that takes what feels like forever. Usually it takes me a couple of days just because I don't want to be sitting by the pot. So I put it on a temperature that's like, medium high, not a boiling roll. I put a screen on top of it so that if it splatters, it's okay. And I just go in occasionally and I stir it, and I just do that until it gets to the consistency that I want it to. So that takes much more time. But that's probably what I'll end up doing with the last round of tomatoes that I have. I can also use a bunch of the tomato sauce that I have in the pantry now to cook it down and use it as a paste. I've also made tomato sauce impromptu when I've needed it and didn't have some ready by getting the tomato sauce that I made and cooking it down. Hopefully that answers that question. Let's see. How long did you let it cool before adding to the jars? I don't have to let it cool. The only reason why it was cool is because of me doing the class today and wanting to have it all ready to go. But if it was ready, I would hot pack everything. So I would make sure my jars were hot at 200 degrees in the oven for 20 minutes, and I'd make sure everything is hot when I'm loading it into the canner. What's the purpose of freezing jarred food when it can be shelf stable sitting in the pantry? I think just not knowing how to can is honestly the answer to that. To me, clearing out the freezer is one of the most sustainable preparedness actions you can take because it's less dependency on the freezer, less freezer space. So I don't really see any benefit of freezing anything other than the fact that there's more nutritional value stored by freezing it versus cooking it or dehydrating it. But that, I guess, would be the only value. We are here on my porch. This is my canning setup. This is my porch. We usually have a table, an extra table for me to set things down on, but for now, I'm going to use this little side burner of my barbecue pit. So this is my canning setup right here. And basically, it's a 2-burner gas stove. So I've got 2 cans of propane tank. Propane can go bad, so it's not something that you necessarily want to stock up on, but I usually always have an extra one full just in case one goes out and runs empty. I can easily switch it over and not lose the progress of what I'm doing. Again, the reason why I have this outdoors is because I have a glass cooktop. There are some people who can on a glass cooktop. The risk is breaking the glass. And that was not a risk that I wanted to take. So I have it hooked up and I've got my water bath canner here and my pressure canner. My water bath canner is literally just like a huge stock pot. And then it's got this tray here. This tray, maybe I can take it out. This tray here is really helpful for when you're hot packing. Because if you got a bunch of hot jars and if your water in here is hot because you've already started the burner, you can load everything in here and then lay it down. Let's see. This does come with a lid that I'll use. So that is my water bath canner. It's super simple. You would do the same thing for pickles. Although I will say that I have found that pickles out of a water bath canner seem to be a little mushy and not as crisp. There's a couple of reasons for that. One could be the recipe, but also because of the heat, literally just cooking the cucumbers. And so there's a different type of pressure water bath canner that you can get for pickles, and I'll share that resource as well. As you can see, this is kind of a rabbit hole that you can start to go down. And I've known a lot of people that said that they have multiple canners for different uses. So I just have the two for the water bath canning and the pressure canning. The pressure canner is a very similar process, and we will do that together at some point. Maybe I'll do like a bone broth or something like that to show y'all. Um, but I think people get really scared about having a massive explosion. And to a degree, it's understandable, but it's kind of like the botulism conversation that we were having earlier. As long as you follow the rules of what you're supposed to do, and it makes it very, very clear as to when it is safe and not safe to open, you really don't have to worry about any explosions. But it is a different setup. You want a specific pressure canner, and they've got a bunch of different kinds. I use the All American. It's aluminum, but nothing aluminum is touching my food. It's just one of those like tried and trustworthy brands that have been around for a while, and that's why I chose it. But I know other people that use different ones and love it. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I have got my propane already attached. I'm going to open the propane. Whenever I'm done canning, I always close the valve to the propane just as an extra safety measure. I'm going to get this started. The way that I have it set right now, I don't know if you can really see it. I don't think you can really see it, but basically I have it so that it's on a full high heat and that I can see that the flame is basically covering the entire pot. Now my water is cold in there because I am cold packing, but if I was hot packing, I would have done this step already so that the water would have been hot while putting in the hot jars. Also, if I was hot packing, I'd be using these tongs specifically for jars to lift these up since they would be hot and put them into the canner. I don't need to use this right now, but I will use these when I take them out of the canner. So the next thing I'm going to do is arrange my jars. And what's important about this step is knowing that everything is evenly spaced. I'm going to show you what it looks like before I put it in. So everything is nice and evenly spaced. And now I'm going to put them into the water. And now what I need to do is when water bath canning, this is one of the differences between water bath canning and pressure canning, is with water bath canning, there needs to be water covering your jars an inch. Whereas in the pressure canner, you only want to have 3 inches of water up on your jar. So no water covering the jars. That would affect the seal for pressure canning. So the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to get my hose and fill this up. There we go. And that is covering everything. See if you can see it. A solid inch. And so now what happens is I'm going to wait for this to come to a boil. As soon as it comes to a rolling boil, I'm going to put the top on and start my timer. All right, you guys. So now we're back in, and it's going to take a few minutes for me to get that rolling boil on the stove. And once it does, according to the Ball Book Planner, I am going to start my timer for 35 minutes. And when the timer is done, I'm going to turn everything off. I can let it cool down in the canner. It's probably what I'm going to do since it's so cold outside and I don't want anything to crack with an extreme temperature. But usually what I would also do is I would just take the jars, put them in my tray, bring them inside, and set them on a towel on the counter. During that process, you'll hear the ting, which is the little lid popping down, all of the oxygen coming out, and they'll cool down on the counter for 24 hours with the lids on, or with the rings on. You will notice that as you pick them up, or as you touch them and they cool down, that the rings have likely shifted a little bit off and they're loose. That's okay. You don't want to tighten them or adjust the rings until you take them off all the way. That can also affect the seal. So at that point, 24 hours later, um, and you can cheat a little bit. You can, once they cool down, you can test the seal. I think that's kind of a good thing to do because if for some reason they didn't seal, and you would see it because the little bump in the middle would still be raised. But if that's the case, then you can clean the lid and then you can can it or just put it in the fridge. So that's one way of making sure that you're not sitting on these jars for 24 hours and some didn't seal. Of course, once you do that, you want to label it with the date and then put it up in the pantry.